Hello, everyone, and welcome to Metrics Data's presentation of Unlock the Power of SaaS today. So today we're going to be talking about SaaS applications, and when we talk about power of them, we're going to talk a little bit about why they're so prevalent in the market, why they've become so successful, not just from our clients' adoption of SaaS products, but also from software publishers' perspective of why they develop SaaS models. And we're going to talk about some ways that you can make these implementations cost effective and some of the gotchas and some of the things that you can watch for. And so, who am I? I'm Mike Austin. I worked at Microsoft in licensing for just shy of 10 years. I've been helping organizations negotiate, software contracts. I've negotiated well over $2 billion of contracts. And I'm really focused on and passionate about helping organizations sort of drive costs out of their software contracts and their cloud contracts. And this is why we're talking about SaaS today. And so this is actually an internal training that I'm doing for my team to help them, kind of identify opportunities to help our clients. And we thought, let's invite, clients and other people in to sit in on this conversation that we're going to have internally today about what to go look for, what's going on in the marketplace, that sort of stuff. So we want this to be interactive. You're probably going to hear my team pop on and ask questions. If anybody's got questions and they're on the Teams version of this, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or put up your hand. And if you want to go on and have a little bit of a conversation, the only thing that we ask is if you are asking questions that are specific to yourself as a company, that you keep your company name and anything that could be considered confidential, just sort of let's talk in generalities so that we don't have to worry about confidentiality clauses or anything to that nature. So let's dive into it here. And I first thought I'd start with, kind of what is SaaS? And I just did a Google search and said, okay, what is SaaS? And ironically, Indeed, which is a job board, had a pretty good definition of it. So I'm not going to read this verbatim, but there's a lot of confusion sometimes about, the difference between SaaS and cloud. And so, if you look at infrastructure as a service, so SaaS obviously stands for software as a service. And there is some confusion because some people try and lump in cloud services, which is, infrastructure or platform as a service. And, the difference really is if you think about, well, I'm going to really simplify this. If you think about SaaS and if you think about cloud services, the difference is cloud services are things that you host at, say, Amazon or Google Cloud or Azure versus purchasing an application and using that application in the cloud. So SaaS apps are really things that you access, applications that your users are going to typically access straight through the cloud. Now, there are some exceptions where there might be, things that get loaded on desktops or, laptops or cell phones in order to access those or to make the access to them easier. And so what do I mean by that? I'm going to use an example of Dropbox, right? So Dropbox is a SaaS application. It's, storage in the cloud, and I can drop my files up there and save them. And I could just go to dropbox.com, log in, drag and drop and put them up there. Or I can load the application on my laptop or my computer and sort of use that to move files up into the cloud to be stored, right? So there's a very simple SaaS scenario, right? And the key thing here is the service is provided in the cloud. I don't have to install a Dropbox, server on my servers in my data center and utilize those. I'm dropping, files up in the cloud and using it there. And a lot of the times that's done straight through a web browser, right? But sometimes there's these clients or things that make access to that a little bit easier. Okay. So a lot of the times I'll be asked, like, who are the big SaaS who are the big SaaS providers, and what sorts of companies are we talking about? There's tons of them, right? There's probably, I kind of half-heartedly say about a trillion others here, but the ones that really started this probably were Salesforce.com. If you think about it, their CRM at the time, they would have been competing with Siebel. Siebel was a massive implementation, installed these servers, and then Salesforce came along and said, hey, just access, just log in through the browser and get access to CRM. But these are things like Dropbox and Box.com and Microsoft 365 and Zoom and GoToMeeting, and all of these are examples of SaaS-based applications, right? You can get into, ServiceNow is a SaaS-based application, Workday is a SaaS-based application. So, they're really these centralized applications that are sold only through subscription. That's a key point, and you're accessing them in somebody else's data centers, and you don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. Okay. And so, why did software companies move to SaaS, right? And I'm going to use Microsoft as a little bit of a case study here. So let's look at what happened with Microsoft and why did they move to SaaS. So let's talk about what Microsoft's big SaaS application is, which is Office 365, or Office 365 itself is not an application, but the products within Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams Online, etc. Why did Microsoft move and have such a massive push to O365, their SaaS product, right? And if we go back to 2010, if you look at Office as a product, what's really changed in Office, right? Fast forward to Office 2023 and go back and look at Office 2010, has much changed in it. It's still Word, PowerPoint, Excel. It still does the things. Microsoft puts new features in it, but 95% of the users don't use those new features. So what's really changed? And so, what started to happen in 2010, actually started before this, but where companies started to really ask, is it worth $500 a license to upgrade? So I know you had software assurance. We're not going to get into the details, but was it really worth it to stay on these maintenance streams to upgrade? Right. So if you think about every enterprise on the planet had Office in their EAs, 90 some odd percent of the big companies had Office in the EAs, and there were billions of dollars. And they were starting to say, Office 2010 is good enough. I don't need 2013 or 2016. I'll just run 2010 for as long as I can. And that really started with Windows XP, right? Because if you think about Windows XP, it was deployed in so many organizations for 10 plus years. Companies skipped Vista altogether. We won't talk about the disaster that was Vista, but companies skipped it altogether. And so if you think about then and go look at back into the enterprise agreements with Microsoft and all the revenue that was associated in there, you had, so much revenue in there. And if I'm looking at it going, what the value of having the OS in my enterprise agreement, there was none, and people were dropping out because they're like, I'm not going to Vista, I'm going to stay on XP, right? And so, or Windows 7 even, right? So if you kind of think about those two products, right? And then you look at the servers that were included in EAs through the client access licenses. You had Exchange and SharePoint and Windows servers. And Microsoft's model was with software assurance was, in order to break even, you needed to upgrade every 4 years. And they would have release cycles of about every 3 years to try and keep it so that people would have a reason to upgrade, right? But most large enterprises were running and willing to run versions of Exchange and SharePoint and Windows servers for 8+ years, right? So if you looked at the value proposition of upgrading every 4 years, they weren't upgrading every 4 years. They were upgrading 8+ years and just running that technology for lots of reasons. We won't get into the reasons why, but there were lots of reasons that they were doing this. Not, some of it was there really enough new functionality in the product to do upgrades, but let's assume there was. It's just these projects were huge. They didn't want to be taking them on all the time. It wasn't a simple, hey, let's move from Exchange 2010 to 2013. Those were big projects that cost lots of money, that they had other priorities that were more important within the IT organizations. And so if you think about it, companies that had perpetual license rights could just walk away from the maintenance, and Microsoft's revenue growth started to dry up, right? And this was what was happening in 2010. And so back then, SaaS was still just starting to come out. And so you got Salesforce out there that's becoming very successful and are kind of one of the first ones in that model. And Microsoft's looking at this going, our revenue is starting to decrease because people aren't renewing, and they own these perpetual licenses and they're not upgrading. In fact, at that time, Microsoft was internally probably thinking that their biggest competitor was themselves, right? So if you went to the Office product team and said, who's your biggest competitor? Their biggest competitor in 2013 with Office 2013 was Office 2010, right? Or Office 2007, we're still. And that probably was more the case. It was probably 2007, more so than 2010. Right. So if you take a look at SaaS and how it rescued Microsoft, this says it all, right? In June 28th, 2011, that's when Microsoft officially launched Office 365. Now they had They had some increments of this before this. They had a program, if anybody was around back then, called BPOS, which was kind of their earlier version of it. And it was kind of like the pilots as they were trying to figure it out. And they probably had those, 3 years before that, 3, 4 years before this. But officially, June 28th, 2011 is when Microsoft launched Office 365. On that day, their share price was $24.23. Today, I think it's $340. It's going to be in between. It's popping up and down a little bit, but today it's $340. Now, is all of that due to Office 365? No, because they got big components of Azure that have driven that growth as well. But you can see what SaaS and cloud has done for Microsoft. Now, if I went back and looked at the price of Microsoft stock in let's say June of 2000, it was probably 100 and some odd dollars, and in June of 2011, it was $24. So prior to this, they were doing this. They moved to a SaaS model and they start doing this, right? How did this help? How did this drive this, right? So if you think about it, there's no more perpetual licenses. So that I own it, I don't need to be stuck on your software assurance or maintenance train has gone away, right? Let's just put this in perspective. Why is Office a subscription? Why would you even call it a SaaS product if you're Microsoft? Because it's still not. It's not centrally deployed. Now, I know they have the Office web apps and it's sort of kind of getting there, but most of the use of Office is open up Word, Excel, PowerPoint on my desktop, create it, save it, send it an email to somebody else to edit it and things like that. Why would they move that? Because of what was happening in 2010, where people were dropping software assurance. So now if I make it a subscription and bundle it in with what would be Microsoft's true SaaS products, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, etc., I'm moving those to subscriptions, right? What was their biggest competitor? It was themselves, Office 2010, Exchange 2010, SharePoint 2010, right? So now if I move to SaaS, I don't have to have this problem of people not upgrading because I'm going to control the upgrades, the upgrade cycles on the back end, right? They also had price control. There's no downward pressure anymore, right? Because if you want to keep that maintenance stream and people own things and they're not upgrading in the 4-year time frames to justify this stuff, you're going to get pressure on your price, right? They were getting a lot of pressure in 2010 on price of Office and Core and Windows OS and things like that, right? Now all of a sudden, when it goes to subscription and people don't own it, they've taken away that price pressure. In fact, what they've been able to do more frequently than they ever did in their history is have increases in prices. There's been multiple increases of prices on Office 365 since 2011. I believe there's been 3 of them. And if you look at Office from Office 97 to Office 2010, I think there was 1 price increase in there, right? So now they're able to increase the price more frequently. The other thing that they did is they locked out any competitors from really entering the market. And they did that because now they took their on-premise install base of these products and moved them into the cloud, into these SaaS models, right? So, why do I use this as an example? Because what other companies are doing are avoiding the problem that Microsoft had by just coming out and taking all the advantages that Microsoft got out of moving to SaaS and starting there, right? So if I want to buy Dropbox, I can't buy an instance of Dropbox to install on my servers. It's just SaaS. If I want to buy Teamwork, I can't buy an instance of Teamwork to put on. It's just SaaS, right? So they've taken out those barriers of entry. They've taken out the challenges that Microsoft had. All that tremendous growth into in their early years to the big downturn that they went through where they were stale for 10 years and massive decrease in stock price to riding it again, right? So everybody wants to follow this model. And you're seeing this in organizations that it makes no sense, right? Like if you think about Office makes no sense to me to be a SaaS model. I get why they're doing it, but it just doesn't make any sense. To me, it makes no sense for Citrix to be a cloud-based license model, but they're moving to this for the same reason. And so you're going to see more and more companies move here because strategically, as a software company, this makes so much sense because you have so much more control over clients and you can lock them in. Right now, what's also gone on is if you look at cloud-based growth This is from Gartner for between 2017 and 2022. Enterprise software spend went up 175%. SaaS went up 241. So that's what we're talking about today. Public cloud went up 358. Now, I have a feeling if we look at this when they launch this in 2024, we'll probably see that enterprise software spend going down even more to kind of almost being flat, and the SaaS and the public cloud spend still continue to grow, maybe not as fast of a rate because there's some growth going, there's slowdown going on there. But this is why the conversation around SaaS is so important, right? The other thing is it's shifted the way that technology is being purchased, right? And who's responsible for it. So it's gone from the point where, and this is an IDG and a Snow study, it's gone from where probably more than half of the spend on SaaS is actually controlled in the business units, not by IT. And there's a lot of challenges with that. We won't get into those today, but you think about security and all the things that could come with that. There's big challenges there, right? And I actually expect that to continue because I know that when I was at Microsoft, I remember having conversations around SharePoint with organizations, marketing organizations at some of my clients, where they wanted to implement it, but IT just didn't want to for a variety of reasons. And so they went out to hosters to implement SharePoint because they could just spend their marketing budget on it. Now, all of a sudden, this organization that probably at the time was Lotus Notes has got SharePoint in there. It's not controlled by IT. They have no clue on what's going on. And this is back when we probably weren't even thinking about data privacy and things like that, right? So, that's why SaaS becomes so popular, because a lot of these SaaS applications, you can just drop onto a website, pop in your credit card, and away you go, right? $20 a month, $30 a month, $100 a month. I'll just expense that. Or in a lot of cases, I'll just eat that because I think that this application is going to be, enabler of my job and make things better for me as an employee or whatever, right? And so it's changing the dynamic of how this stuff gets bought, how technology gets introduced into organizations and things like that. Then Gartner came out and basically said, this is back in 2019, and this holds true. We see this. In fact, I think this 30% might even be a little bit low, right? But they said that through 2022, organizations without effective software asset management practices will waste 30% on their cloud spend. And we see that. Like when we analyze with our Slim tool, Office 365, we actually see higher than 30% on average of waste. Right? When you look at even, take that beyond Azure and you look at, or sorry, take that beyond O365 and look at Azure, we see greater than 30% waste in Azure spend. And most of the time it's what we're about to start to talk about here, right? Okay, so today's webinar or today's training topic is all about what does this have to do with successful SaaS, right? Like what does this mean, right? And the reason that I've gone through this background in this is all software companies are developing SaaS products or models or web, right? It is rare today that you see a software company launch that's launching a perpetual software, right? I actually can't think of one off the top of my head where there's a new one where it's not some sort of subscription-based licensing model. And you think about it, even video games today are variants of SaaS. So for those of you that have kids like I do that play Fortnite has season passes that are a huge business for them. Right? And season passes are, I don't know, 3 months long, and you pay $10 a season in order to get the latest gear to gig out your character or whatever it is in Fortnite. But even video games have gone into these models. Right? The street loves them, the clients, the software companies love them. It's all about recurring revenues, right? I already talked about that they have these low barriers to entry, right? Put your credit card on the internet and you get started. Because they're subscription based and because they're typically accessed directly through the web, they're very hard to track. So, there was a lot of talk a few years ago about shadow IT. The talk of it is kind of calmed down. You don't hear it as much, but it's still out there, right? It's so easy for these applications to get bought by business units and by individual employees in a company that they're out there and you don't even know they're out there, right? We know this because after looking at 5 million O365 accounts, that over 27% of the subscriptions are not being used, and another 21% are oversized. Right? So we know that it's hard to track. We know that the usage is hard to track. We know usage from are they actually using it, or are they using the features of it are very hard. And this happens with every SaaS vendor. If any of you can tell me when you bought a SaaS product and your SaaS vendor emailed you and said, "Hey, you're on the enterprise version, but you're only using standard, so we're going to downgrade you next month." Like that never happens, right? And so, I always say things like I always want to look at these things and say, okay, how do we put this in perspective? So ask yourself if you're, if you're a customer, or for my team, ask your customers this. How many Salesforce licenses do you have? Right? And how many do you actually think are in use? Because you're going to hear something like, we have 1,000. And I don't know. My guess is we're probably using 500. But we're paying for 1,000 because we don't have the data to determine whether we're actually using 500 or 1,000, right? Now, the next thing to ask them is, what version are you buying? Oh, well, we're buying the enterprise version because that's where we got the best deal from Salesforce. Okay, so you bought licenses that you don't know if you need the functionality of, that were the most expensive because you got the highest discount, and you don't know whether they're using it. That's called vendor lock-in, guys. That's exactly what it is, and that's exactly what these sales forces of all these SaaS companies are taught to do. Okay, doesn't matter whether it's Salesforce, whether it's Workday, whether it's ServiceNow. This is the model, and they teach their sales reps how to do this. Oh, you want the enterprise because you don't want to have to go and count how many using standard features and enterprise features, and managing that's a pain in the butt. And so I'm just going to give you the best discount I can on the enterprise. You're going to get the best deal. You go here. Oh, you don't need, O3, E3 versus E4. Like, they all do the same thing. Okay. And so what can you do like this? So if you think about things, history always repeats itself. It just shows up in different ways, right? So if you think back in the early 2000s, when virtualization started, you had VM sprawl, right? It was like, oh, VMware come out, I can make one server and make it into 100. All this VM sprawl happened, right? And so you just sprawled and you didn't know what to do about it. Your licensing costs and your controls got out of place. And then you had to go and get some data, start to look at that data, figure out how to control it, and then you brought that VM environment back in place. Same thing with first time you audited. You didn't know what to do. You got to audit it. You have no clue. You wouldn't even know how to run an audit, those sorts of things. And so it's the same sort of thing. What do you need? The first thing you need is visibility into usage. Now, a lot of people are like, how do I get that with SaaS products? Right? Because it's not like I can go out and inventory desktops to figure out what's out there if they're just getting into the browser. And I'm going to get into that in a second. But typically it starts, I want to look for API access, but there's a couple other things that you can do here, right? But the first thing you need is visibility. And then the process that you run through is going to be the exact same from there, right? You got to normalize that data. You got to categorize that data. You got to augment it with additional data from other systems to understand usage. So examples of that are what licensing metrics, what application type, are there security risks, what data from other systems do I need? This sound familiar to my team? Gary, are you on here? Is Gary on here? Or Ben? Ben's on. Ben, does this sound familiar?
Absolutely.
Right? Like this is the same thing that if I'm auditing SQL servers on premise, this is the same process that you have to go through. I got to get inventory data and usage, right? I got to normalize that stuff to make sure that I have all the versions, additions, all that sort of stuff. Okay. All the additions, versions, all that sort of stuff. I got to take a look at the normalized data and make sure I have all the license metrics and I own all my license entitlements. I understand that. I got to take a look at Active Directory to figure out whether servers are active or not active. It's the same sort of process, right? And so, I'll ask a question of my clients, right? When was the last time you compared your Active Directory to your user data in a SAP or in your SaaS apps? Right? And the reason that I say that is we know, right, to my team, when we're looking at Office 365, what do we find all the time? About 20 some odd percent of their users aren't even active on the system, but they have licenses assigned to them, right? So blocked accounts, service accounts, all that stuff that we go and look for, right? But the reality is when we go and tell a client that that's $20 a month because they're paying for an E3 for those, 20% of their users. So let's say it's a 10,000 user organization. For those 2,000 users, that's 40,000 a month or $500,000 a year that you're wasting, right? It's really not 400,000. It's probably more like $250,000, so it's probably more like 4 million. Because if you think about all the other SaaS applications that they have, then they're going to have that. Like if you've got users that are blocked that haven't been on the system in 3 years that have O365 subscriptions assigned to them, they probably got Okta assigned to them. They probably got Salesforce assigned to them. It goes on and on and on. And it's probably more like $250 on average, right? So for the team, the Metrics Data 360 team, when we're working with clients on Slim and we're looking at O365, we have to have conversations with them about what other SaaS apps you have, because this is a bigger problem than just O365. If I'm looking at, I don't know, Okta or some other SaaS app, it's not just that, it's bigger than that, right? And you have to think like that because this is how you get action. Right? It's not a $400,000 problem. It's a $4 million problem. And here's why. Because all the SaaS apps that you're spending, you're probably spending 10 times as much money on all the SaaS apps. Okay. So the next question is obviously, how do I get access or how do I get visibility? So this is the hardest part, right? Because if it's just based through through a browser, what should I do? So let's say I don't know what the app is. It's like Mike.com. Mike.com has this SaaS app, right? How do I get it? The first thing that I would do is I would go and see if there's an API. If there's an API, I would want to go and look in that API and see what sort of data is in there, and I would want to pull that data, and I would get that. I would also look and see if in my organization we had some SAM tools that have SaaS connectors, because there are some out there. Like Slim has a decent SaaS connector. There's some in ServiceNow. Our Slim 360 product for O365 has a SaaS connector. So I go and see if I can get a SaaS connector. And then I would look at things like, are there things that, that I can employ on the desktop? So for instance, if it was box.com, maybe you look at through our desktop agents where we can do inventory to see where box.com, where the Box app is installed. Doesn't necessarily mean they have a subscription, but it's going to be an indicator that they potentially could. So where can I find that the app is installed? I might want to look at web browser extensions. Are there extensions in the web browser that I can look for to go out and figure this stuff out? Right? I might also want to look in other systems. So can I go and look in like HR systems? Can I look in finance systems, right? So if I want to find out if SaaS apps are out there, right? Like if you think about Silo's whole approach to SaaS apps is go into the financial systems and figure out if people were expensing stuff on their credit cards, right? But the SaaS companies do not make this easy, right? So this is difficult. It's not easy. It's not impossible, but it's not easy, right? So that's where I would start, right? And then what happens from there? This will be familiar to my team, right? This is an on-premise thing, but this process that I'm about to talk through is exactly the same for SaaS app. Okay. So what is this? So on the bottom are things that you're going to want to try and automate. On the top are things that are going to be manual processes or require human. So I'm going to walk through this and explain this on how this works, right? So the first thing I need to do if I'm doing an on-premise audit is go out and do discovery. What's the first thing I need to do if I'm going to do a SaaS audit? Do discovery. I have to get data, right? So in the on-premise world, that might have been I go and run reports in SCCM or Altiris or ILMT, etc., right? And then I pull that data, and then I got to normalize that data, right? By normalizing, I mean I got to go and look, do I have versions, editions, do I have processors and cores, whatever the license metrics are. Same thing when I get data out of cloud. If I pull something through an API, I got to go look through that data and I got to normalize it so that it aligns to the license metrics, which are a little bit further over here on the right? So I'm going to normalize this stuff. I'm going to categorize it. There's all kinds of things that I can do here. So in our terms, a lot of the times, or if you're in FinOps world, this is kind of what tagging is about, right? How do I tag these things with additional metadata that becomes valuable? So what's the app? What's the type of app? What's that app doing, right? So is it a security product? Is it a project management tool? Is it, an HR system? What is it, right? What other tools do I need in order to pull that in? So in our world, and I think even in the SaaS world, or not in our world, but in the on-premise world, even in the SaaS world, I might need to pull in Active Directory data so that I can look at that and compare that to user data, et cetera, right? And so I'm gonna still pull that all stuff together, do all the stitching of it so that we can get a single source view. Then I'm going to normalize it, right? And then I want to go and look at the software license metrics. So how do I buy that? Is it user based? Is it consumption based? Is it based on some storage metric? What is it, right? What are the restrictions on that? So even if it's user based, are there restrictions on the amount of storage I get? How do I measure that? Right? How do I then take that and correlate that back to the normalized data to figure out how much of this stuff I need? Right? And then I want to take that stuff. I want to install. I want to take the entitlements that I own or the subscriptions. I guess more is a better way to put this. I want to take the subscriptions that I own, put those in a database so that I can look at those and compare this to this normalized data. Then up top, I want somebody that understands contracts to review the contract language to see what's in there, to see if there's anything there. Like if you think about it, when we're looking on premise, are there disaster recovery rights? Are there dev rights? Are there sandbox rights? Are there blah, 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 blah? Just go out and look for those sorts of things. Read the contracts to figure out where there's opportunities to look at non-standard licensing metrics that we can't get in the normalized data to decrease the number of things we need to buy. Then I want to take that vendor and see if I have some expertise in the organization or external to the organization that will know things about them, right? So for instance, with Salesforce, do you have somebody on your side that knows what Salesforce will do? How will they negotiate? Will they give you a better deal if you do multiple years? What sort of discounts should you be looking at? Do you really need enterprise versus standard licenses? Then I want to populate that into my CMDB, some of that being automated, but I want to take all that data to get it in there. So then I got my centralized source of truth. Right? So this chart was developed for on-premise. It's the exact same for SaaS. Right? So a lot of people that talk about asset management for SaaS and it's, I don't know where to start. Yes, you do. You start where you would start on-premise. I got to go get data. How do I get the data? On-premise, I would go and try and find inventory tools. If I don't have inventory tools, what am I going to do? So I got to go get SaaS. Is there an API? Can I get that API? Cool. What data is in there? Is it the right data? Good. Let me start normalizing it. If not, what can I do next? Can I see if there's an agent installed out there? Do I need to do both? Right? You're gonna kind of think through that based on the vendor. Okay. So then the next thing becomes, how can I optimize my SaaS spend? Right. And so, there's some things that are easy, there's some things that are hard, and then there's some things that are a process. Okay. And so one of the easiest things to do is to get rid of over purchase licenses. I mean, this is one of the things my team knows, but it drives me nuts. I don't know how many times I see customers carrying 10% more Office 365 licenses and all these SaaS subscriptions than they need because they don't want to have to go to procurement when they onboard somebody new and cut a PO or do whatever they need to do in order to get a thing. So they'll spend millions of dollars more than they need to sit on unused licenses. Now, some of those unused licenses sit in there because they're stuck in contracts that say when they can get rid of them or they can't get rid of them, or if you don't renew those, we're going to increase your price. That all becomes a negotiation, and don't let the vendors play that game. Negotiate really, really hard against them, right? The harder thing is, it's easy to look and go, we've got 500 of these, we only have 400 installed. Well, sometimes that's easier said than done, right? How do I get that data? Where does it sit? All that sort of stuff, right? Harder things would be to start to look at Active Directory, to look at your users that have these SaaS subscriptions assigned to them, to figure out if they're actually using them, and creating profiles of users and creating tagging policies and the things that we just talked about, right? The next step would be to create an optimal bill of materials for the renewal. So we now know, hey, Salesforce, we don't need 10,000, we only need 5,000. And oh, by the way, we don't need 5,000 enterprise. We need 4,000 standard and 1,000 enterprise, because we've gone and looked at the workflow of how our users are actually using this stuff, and we're not guessing anymore, right? You want to scare Salesforce, there's how you go do that, right? And so you're going to get rid of those unused licenses. You're also going to have alternatives ready, all that sort of stuff. And then as you're going through that categorization, so we talked about normalization, and one of those things being categorization, you want to look for and identify the redundant applications, right? So I can guarantee you most organizations are going to have project, and they're going to have other project management, and they're going to have people that have Basecamp and Asana and all these sorts of things in there. They just don't know it. And so can you get rid of redundant and get it out of departmental buying or individual buying so that you know we get bigger volume so we can go to Asana as our single source or Basecamp, it doesn't matter which one, and say instead of buying 50, we're going to buy 500 because we're going to get rid of all these other three and get a better deal. Better still do an RFP against them all to see where you get the best deal and then go that way, right? But you want to get rid of the redundant applications, and then you want to optimize the license types. And I love to pick on CRM. I don't care if it's Salesforce, HubSpot, Dynamics 365. I'd go and ask my sales team, do they really all need Salesforce Enterprise? And quite honestly, let's be honest, sales reps never touch CRM. I mean, I was in sales organizations that had CRM systems for 10 years. I don't think I ever went into them as a sales rep. I always had an inside rep or an admin person that would do all of that for me. But every company I worked for had a $200+ a month subscription for me to be on a CRM system, and I never used it. And we just identified one customer, looked at one customer's Dynamics 365, and they had 65% of their users never touched it. And we gave them the data to show them that. So you can imagine taking out 65% of your CRM budget because you had data to show it. This is what you're able, you're going to find those sorts of things. These guys are all bloated. That's why they don't make it easy, right? Like if you ask Salesforce to help you with this, they're not going to help you, right? Because they know they have the stats internally. They know, right? And so, anyways, that's sort of what I wanted to go through today. I don't know, does anybody have any questions? Because I think really what I wanted to get through today is that SaaS and the process of identifying SaaS applications and things like that, it's no different than the on-premise do regular inventory that you do. It's just different. Where do I go get the data? How do I get the data? But the process and everything is exactly the same. So I'll open it up and see if there's any questions? If not, I'll, thanks for, thanks for coming out, and we'll give everybody a little bit of time back. Hey, awesome. Everybody have a great day. Thank you.